This time on Hot Rod Hoarders, we're featuring Gene Cromer and the history and resurrection of his 1941 Willys coupe named the Moonlighter. Stick around to see this thing evolve from 1960s gasser superstar to being stashed away in Gene's barn to finally being restored and put back on the track with Gene behind the wheel. Back in the day, Gene Cromer was a well-known drag racer in the Southeast, and this 1941 Willys coupe is what gave him that reputation. Gene bought this car at Guy Motors in Anderson, South Carolina. He paid $150 for it and he drove it home, but he didn't have intentions of driving this thing on the street. He wanted to build a race car. His long list of hopes and dreams ended up making for kind of a slow process, and he got impatient, and he ended up buying a 55 Chevy that was already sort of turned into a drag car. And he put his motor that he was planning to put in the Willys in the 55 Chevy. Now this was a Ford motor and a Chevrolet. It's kind of an odd combination. But he hit the track with this thing, and he said almost every time he raced it that it broke something. And he got discouraged with it. He ended up taking the motor back out of it, sold the 55 body, and jumped back on the 41 Willys project. Around this time, which was about 1964, Gene was running an automotive repair shop and speed shop. And he was doing work on regular passenger cars, hot rods, drag cars, anything he could bring in to make a dollar. And he had a customer come in. His name was Melvin Craft. And Melvin had an issue with his shifter. Gene ended up installing a Hurst floor shifter in his car and put him back on the road. But what they didn't realize is that Gene and Melvin would become great friends, and they really hit it off. Melvin wasn't necessarily a car guy, but he became one. Finally, after countless hours, day and night working on this Willys, Gene was able to debut the car at an NHRA sanctioned race at the Donaldson Air Force Base in Greenville, South Carolina. After Gene got home from that first big race in Greenville, he was pretty happy with the car's performance, but he wanted to spice up the appearance with some hand lettering, so he had the Mad Striper come in, and they named the car the Moonlighter, and that name actually came from Gene's wife, Ruth, who made the observation that this car was being built under the light of the moon because it was happening during the middle of the night, during the evenings and weekends when Gene had some spare time. It was pretty much all getting used on building this car. So the Moonlighter was born when that famous hand lettering was applied back in 1965. And he always pulled it with this 1958 Ford Ranchero and an open trailer. Just imagine being a kid and seeing this thing go down the highway. It was an awesome combination, and it got a lot of attention. You'll notice that the Ranchero has a custom tube grill, and Gene actually used the leftovers from the original grill to make the insert in the Willys, because you might notice in some of the early pictures of the Willys it just had sort of a homemade wire grill, and he added this mesh in there. It looked a lot better, filled in the hole, and still allowed the radiator to get some air. When he originally built the car, he put fiberglass doors, fiberglass fenders, hood, deck lid to lighten the car tremendously, and he gutted out all the interior, again just trying to shave as much weight as possible. Gene kept the original front axle, but he did lift the front suspension a little bit to kind of give it the weight transfer that it needed. But you'll notice through the years that he lowered the suspension a little bit at a time. Out back he installed a 9-inch Ford rear end with 486 gears, and originally he set it up with the original Willys leaf springs. And ultimately he landed on sort of an early version of a ladder bar setup. So it's got these rectangular arms that mount to the rear end and to the frame. And then it's got a set of Coney coilover shocks, which were revolutionary at the time. He bought them from Holman Moody, which they were at the forefront of racing technology during that time. And it really changed how he could tune the way that this car launched. Because back then you didn't have much control over how the track would be prepped. In fact, most tracks didn't get prepped at all. There was no such thing as glue on the track. You'd be lucky if they just went out there with a broom and brushed off the gravel or dust or whatever that was on the track. So, back then you really had to try hard to make these cars hook up. The tire technology wasn't there, the track prep wasn't there, so you had to use the weight of the car and any trick you could to make the thing hook up and stay hooked up all the way down the track. Although you may not notice it at first, Gene actually altered the wheelbase on this car ever so slightly. You'll see in some of these pictures that the rear fender has sort of a different look to it, and that's because he reshaped that fender to go along with the new rear end placement. So it didn't look out of place at all. It actually looked like a factory fender with a factory wheelbase, but it was actually scooted forward just a little bit. And the point of that was to help with weight balance. The further forward you could get that rear end, the more weight would kind of hang off of the back, and that would help with traction. So, they were looking for every little trick they could get, and moving that rear end forward just a little bit was one of those tricks, and he disguised it very well by reshaping that rear fender. Originally, the car had a set of magnesium American Racing Torq Thrust wheels, 15x4 up front, 15x8 on the back, and those things changed throughout the years. He went through several different configurations on tire and wheel packages, sometimes to change the weight bias on the car, sometimes to just change the appearance, but ultimately through the years he changed to several different combinations. Here we've got a picture of it with some steel wheels that are chrome plated, kind of an odd look compared to other 60s gassers. I'm not sure exactly what those wheels are. Then he changed later on to actually a 4-lug wheel. He put a set of 4-lug Hilborn front runners on this car, and then he had Hilborns on the back for a little while. Sometimes he ran them conventionally, and other times, like in this picture, you'll see that he has the wheels turned around backwards. And a lot of times people would do that to kind of change the offset. And you'll notice the first version of his wheelie bars were actually just wheels that kind of came straight down from that big stainless steel rear bumper. And that evolved through the years. And he eventually built his own wheelie bars out of leaf springs, and that mounted to the rear end. It allowed for a little bit of adjustability and a little bit more forgiveness than that straight down wheelie bar like his original design. The engine in the Moonlighter started life as a 427 cubic inch Ford FE, but Gene had plans to make big horsepower with this thing, so he started with a crankshaft company crank, which brought the displacement up to 468 cubic inches. He had Mickey Thompson aluminum rods and a set of Forged True pistons that had 13.5 to 1 compression. Gene did some custom tricks to the high riser heads, and then he had a custom ground camshaft from Holman and Moody. To finish off the big Stroker FE motor, it's got a Vertex magneto and Hilborn mechanical fuel injection. And it was mated up to a 4-speed originally, but Gene switched over to an automatic in 1967. The intention of switching from a manual transmission to an automatic transmission was to try to tame this car because it was doing some big wheel stands and it was really unpredictable. He had to figure out some other ways to kind of tune the launch on this thing to control it a little more and make it a little bit more consistent. The best this car ever ran was a 983 at 145 miles an hour, which was on pace for A-gas in the mid-1960s. Gene raced this car competitively in A-gas in 1965, 66, and 67. He raced in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Florida, and as far north as Indianapolis for the U.S. Nationals. And he made a name for himself. This car made a name for itself. And, after winning some races and having some really good success, that led to him getting booked in for match races, and it made him extremely busy. He was on the road all the time, going to different drag strips, sometimes 2 or 3 different drag strips in a single week, just to go out there and compete either in an A-gas sanctioned race or in some of these more outlaw type match races at tracks all over the Southeast. So he raced at tracks such as 13 Forks Drag Strip, Jeffco Dragway, Greer, Blaney, Shuffletown, Atlanta Speed Shop Dragway, Paradise Drag Strip, and then he raced at big tracks like Rockingham, Bristol, Indianapolis. He raced all over the place and did really well with this car. It was a very successful and a very busy racing program. There were a few occasions where Gene and Melvin put nitromethane in the Moonlighter. A couple of those times it was at run what you brung type races, which were pretty common at outlaw tracks in the Southeast, and Gene ran the Willys in one of these run what you brung races at Paradise Drag Strip and put on a pretty big show for the fans. Paradise had actually shortened the track to 1,000 feet for these run what you brung races for safety reasons, because these cars were just kind of out of control and the braking systems weren't great, and parachute technology wasn't what it is today. Gene made his run and he made a great pass as far as speed, but he actually went through the lights backwards, out of control, but he didn't actually hit one of the guardrails or anything like that. but he did have to put it on the trailer. Pretty much, you know, his tires were kind of messed up and he had a broken spindle, according to this article. But, you know, that's the kind of action you came to expect with these match races and run what you brung events. When 1967 rolled around, Gene started making some changes on the car, and we had talked about the rear suspension changes, how it went from leaf spring over to this new coilover system on the back. And, you know, there was other changes in the car setup as well, but the real change in Gene's racing program was that he was building a new car. He was building the Moonlighter 2. It was a Ford Mustang. It was a roadster type car, and he was going to run it as a funny car. This was a nitro burning, fuel injected Ford motor, and, you know, he was planning to kind of go with the changes that the drag racing world was seeing in 1967. And a lot of gasser racers started building AFX cars and these early funny cars. He jumped in, did the exact same thing, and then he raced this car for a couple of years while using the Willys as sort of a backup car. You know, if he had a match race booked in and something major broke on the Mustang, he could always bring the Willys and still put on a great show for the fans. He raced the Willys periodically through the late 60s, but you can see in this picture in 1968 that he actually had a 427 Cammer sitting in this thing, and he eventually built a Ford Maverick with a Cammer in it, and he raced it in pro stock for a short amount of time. But during all of this time, the Willys was still somewhat active. You know, he was still making some changes here and there on the car, and, you know, it's still a pretty relevant car even up into the early 70s. So by 1971, Gene's racing days were starting to slow down a little bit. He was still working really hard in his shop. He was still fooling with hot rods and drag cars. But as far as being out on the road every single weekend, that was starting to slow down a little bit. And, you know, he had a family at home. His wife, Ruth, and his two daughters, you know, they were growing up. Time was rolling by as he was out on the road. And even though he was able to take them with him on occasion, you know, it was still really tough on the family for him to be out on the road all the time. So ultimately, around 1971, things started to slow down. The Willys sort of got pushed off to the side. The Ford Maverick got pushed off to the side. The funny car was outdated and just wasn't in the picture anymore. But Gene decided to hang on to this Willys, and he did for many years. He stashed it away, and, you know, the car sat pretty much untouched for a lot of years. And you can see the car here sitting in a barn, and it's all in gray primer, which is kind of the last step of this car's racing career. It was just in primer, didn't have the lettering or anything like that on it. But you can see it sitting here on a trailer, no wheels or tires. It's just kind of, you know, remnants of what it used to be. And ultimately, the car ended up leaving Gene's possession. He let another guy borrow it who was building fiberglass bodies. He was starting a new business, and he wanted to build a 1940 or 41 Willys coupe body to be able to sell to street riders. And this was during the 1990s, and the car had been sitting for almost 20 years, so, you know, it was one of those things that Gene didn't mind letting him borrow this car. Well, unfortunately, they had to completely disassemble the car to make molds and build patterns and stuff for these new bodies, and Gene didn't end up getting the car back until quite a while later. Unfortunately, he had to go pick the car up, and it was completely disassembled. It was sitting there pretty much in shambles. So he loaded everything that he could get onto the trailer and brought it back home and just stashed it away for many more years, you know, really kind of losing hope in any potential of making this thing a project, because now that it was all tore apart, it just didn't have the same look and feel that it did. Even when it was kind of sitting there in the barn just in primer with no wheels and tires, it still looked like his old car. Now it was just kind of a basket case. So fast forward lots of years, and Gene gets a Facebook message from a guy named Quain Stott. Now, if you've been around drag racing very much, you've probably heard that name. He's a world championship winning pro mod driver, and at the time he had built a 41 Willys gasser, which was called the Executioner. And he built this thing because his first real taste of gasser drag racing, or any drag racing in general, was at Shuffletown Drag Strip just outside of Charlotte, and he saw Gene Cromer and a few other really big names at a big gasser race. He saw them making passes, and it hooked him. He was hooked for life. And so his first gasser build was this Willys, kind of, you know, as a tribute to Gene. So what really kicked off this relationship is that Quain wanted to share these old home movies that he had found from Shuffletown Drag Strip that featured the Moonlighter. And he wanted to be able to go take that to him, talk drag racing, let him know about this new association that he had put together, the Southeast Gassers Association, and just share some drag racing stories, regular bench racing. And so ultimately that conversation turned into talking about the fact that the Moonlighter still existed, except it was all took apart, and it was really kind of a forgotten project at this point. But it really kind of gave Quain some hope that he could help Gene put this car back together. So the more they talked about it, the more Quain realized that most of the parts were still there. Gene still had so many memories and so many keepsakes from his gasser racing days that this was going to be the ultimate race car restoration. So after that initial conversation, Gene and Quain really hit it off, and a plan was put together to bring the old Moonlighter out of the garage, bring the parts out of the barn, and put this thing back together. Now, they could have just stuck it back together with those original parts, and they could have made a really cool Survivor or a really cool static display car, but that was not in Gene's interest. He wanted to get this thing back on the track. And he had plenty of stuff left over. He had lots of engine parts that he had been hanging on to for years. He had enough stuff to build this car without spending a tremendous amount of money tracking down parts and things like that. They started working on this thing in 2012, and really kind of the first steps were getting it out. And I've got this great video that Darren Gray sent me of them carrying the body out, and you can see Gene and Quain talking things over. You can just see both of their wheels turning as they're looking at this project and just figuring out how to go about making this thing safe, making it period correct, and making it fast. There was no point in doing this if this car was just gonna putt down the track. He wanted it to be able to really make some noise and make some fast passes. So the first big step in this process was getting that chassis and body up to Quain Stott's shop. He had been building drag cars for years. He's been doing chassis work, roll cages, suspension work. He's been doing this stuff for decades. And, to build a period correct gasser is kind of going backwards as far as technology goes. But he had to really take a step back and look at how to set this car up so that it would work, number one, so that the suspension would work and the car would hook up and go straight. But number two, he wanted to still pay tribute to the way this car was set up back in the 60s. So he started by getting the frame straight. From the rear frame section being broken, there was a lot of stuff on this car that was kind of tweaked. And so that was priority number one, is get that frame straight, get it strengthened, add a few braces and cross members so that the thing would be solid and square, and then start fabricating new suspension components to go along with some of the leftover parts that Gene had in his collection. Quain completely rebuilt the rear suspension, but he stayed true to the design that Gene had put in place back in 1967. He built 2 ladder bars, and he built new mounts, new everything to make this thing structurally sound and get rid of some of the rusty and crusty pieces on this thing. And he actually utilized those original Coney coilovers that Gene got back in 1967. They actually sent those things back to Coney and had them rebuild them. And they're as good as new. They're a really rare pair of coilovers. Only a handful of these things were made, but they're still in action on the back of this car today. Quain was also responsible for updating the safety items on this car, and the first big project was building a roll cage. And Quain's done tons of roll cages, but this one was a little bit different because he wanted to add safety to this car by having a more significant roll cage, but he didn't want it to be seen. He didn't want it to stick out like a sore thumb on this historic car. So he added lots of bars to this thing, made it safe, made it legal, and ultimately he built a false firewall which completely hides all those roll cage tubes, and it looks cool. It looks the part. And it really just looks like a continuation of that aluminum dash that's in the car. And you'd never notice unless I was telling you that that was the purpose of that, but it was one of those really creative designs that Quain is known for when it comes to hiding modern safety equipment or modern features on these period correct cars. Quain was also responsible for doing all of the tin work in the car. He made new wheel tubs, new floor pans, lots of new interior panels. And, you know, he made tons of little brackets, tons of pieces to, like, mounting the steering column, mounting gauges, mounting everything. You know, it was really well thought out. It wasn't just a thrown together car, and there was no formula for it. It wasn't like he was following a pattern of building a new Pro Mod car or something like that. This was something he had to really think about, put a lot of effort into.
40 years.
How's it feel to be back in it, Gene?
Feels good. Just right.
Does it feel like it's supposed to?
Yeah.
When Quain finished up with the chassis and suspension work, the car went back to Gene's shop and it underwent a complete restoration as far as the car's appearance goes. The car was completely blasted, stripped down to the bare metal and the bare fiberglass. He had Rick Miller do the blasting. He had Chris Dunn that helped him with some fiberglass work. He had all sorts of people come through, and, you know, even if it wasn't an outright donation, people were donating their time. People were lending their time to help him get this thing back going again. And it was a big deal for Gene and for Melvin to be a part of this. And, you know, it was kind of a big team effort. Other people who helped on this thing were Dennis, John, and Chris Glenn. They handled the interior work, putting that tricky headliner in there. They put blue Lexan in. They did a lot of work to make this thing completely trimmed out and look really good. Chris Harper was in charge of the bodywork and paint on the car, and he really straightened up the old body and put a coat of Nassau blue on this car. And that's originally what it was back in 1965, and that's what Gene wanted to go back with for this restoration. And after it was sanded and buffed and polished, Charlie Tire put the hand lettering on there and recreated that iconic Moonlighter logo on the side of the car and really put the finishing touches on this restoration. While all that work was going on to make the Moonlighter look good, Gene was focused on making it fast. He actually mocked up a 427 Camry in this thing originally, but ended up building a high riser engine because that was the most successful setup in this car's history. This new engine setup is very similar to the high riser that Gene ran back in the 60s, except this one's got a stock crankshaft instead of the stroker, but it's got a ton of old school parts on it and the inside of it, lots of old school tricks, and, you know, it really looks the part. It's got all period correct parts on the outside, including those white headers, the chrome valve covers, the Hilborn injectors. Everything about this thing is 1960s. The aluminum radiator might look out of place, but that's actually a factory Ford piece from a lightweight Galaxie. It's period correct and it's extremely rare. He actually ended up building another engine for this car a little while later, and this one was based off of a 427 tunnel port. You know, and it was really satisfying to watch this car progress and go from, you know, basically a forgotten old project into a masterpiece, a completely restored piece of drag racing history. One of the coolest things about the restoration of this car is that they made a really big deal about debuting it. They didn't just show up at some show or drag race. It was made into an event. And all this happened at Greer Dragway in May of 2013. And they rolled the car out there, they had a cover over it, you know, tons of people were surrounding the car, people who had chipped in on the build process and the restoration, and then of course Gene and his family were there as well. And it was just a really special moment to be able to pull that cover off of the car and, you know, just to hear the fans cheering, because this is an iconic piece of drag racing history, especially in South Carolina. In the years after the debut, Gene wanted to actually race with the Southeast Gassers Association, and Quain Stott actually made a rule just for Gene to allow him to run, because he had an automatic transmission, and Quain has a rule that every gasser must have a 4-speed or any type of manually shifted transmission. So, he made an exception, grandfathered in Gene into the rules package so that he could come out and race with these period correct cars. And he was competitive. He ran in the A-gas class, and we're talking 50 years between this car's beginning and its restoration. So, quite a bit of time had passed, and Gene got behind the wheel of that car, and it was just awesome to see. It was awesome to see him be in his element again. And I think for a lot of people, especially Quain and a lot of the people who chipped in and helped on this car, it was more than just a happy emotion, of watching this car go down the track. I mean, this was just like watching your hero get back into the car that made him a hero and see that car go down the track again under full power. We're not talking about, just babying it down the track. We're talking about lifting the front wheels off the ground and, blasting down the 8th mile. And that's something, that people don't necessarily understand, is the importance of keeping this history alive. Sure, it's great to have cars that are restored perfectly, that are museum pieces, or that are like Cacklefest type cars. That's fine, and that's to be appreciated. But when you rebuild a car and you actually go out there and put the hammer down, it's a whole different animal. And of course, there's a chance of wrecking that car. There's a chance of parts breaking. There's all sorts of risk involved in this, but it was a risk they were willing to take. Gene is a man of great faith, and he put Joshua chapter 1 verse 9 on the little dash panel when he restored this car. And it says, "Have I not commanded thee? Be strong and of good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee wherever thou goest." And for Gene, that means whether he's behind the wheel of this incredible Willys gasser, or whether he's at home, or whether he's in the shop, he knows that God is with him. And that's a really powerful verse, and it's, something to kind of live by. That verse means a lot to a lot of people. I had the pleasure of watching Gene make several passes in this car. He was making some pretty quick passes. If you do the math, really this thing is actually quicker than it was back in the 60s. And that's mainly because the tracks are better, the tires are better. There's been a lot of advancements in that 50 years between this car's heyday and the car's current status. So, this thing it's definitely quick. It definitely puts on a show, and people just love the history of it. They love the story behind it. And if you walk through the pits and you see Gene and see his family and you see the smiles on their faces, you can see what this is all about. You can see why it's such a big deal that this car was restored and brought back to its former glory. And that's part of why I wanted to feature it here on this video. This car had been featured in several magazines. It was featured in the Rodder's Journal, which was a beautiful feature, beautifully written article by Jerry Berger. And, it's been in lots of other publications. But I wanted to tell this story in a little bit different way, be able to give you all the details that I could scrape up on this car, show you all the old pictures that I could dig up. And I had to say a huge thank you to Frank Taylor. He's one of the guys who was around the car back in the day, and he was around for the restoration. And, he took lots of videos of the car in action in its current state. And, he's just been around this thing pretty much all of its life. So, huge thank you to Frank Taylor. Another big thank you to Darren Gray. He was there for sort of the unearthing of this car and the early stages of rebuilding it. And again, just great pictures and videos that these guys have captured that really helped me tell the story. So, I'm very appreciative of that. And I'm appreciative of Quain Stott for documenting so much of the build. I mean, that took special care and special effort to be able to stop what he was doing and take those pictures of the progress of this rebuild. And most of all, I'm thankful for Gene for hanging on to this car and hanging on to all those old school parts. 90% of this car is original 1960s components. And you know, the other 10% were just made up in modern conveniences, modern safety equipment and things like that. But for the most part, this car is very original, very correct for the era. And I mean, it is as real as it gets. Gene held on to a lot of old pictures and time slips and other pieces of this car's history. So I really appreciate his efforts in keeping this stuff because it allowed me to document this car better than any other car I've featured on the channel. There's no telling how many people were influenced by this car, whether they saw it at their local track or they might have even saw it on the highway getting pulled by that awesome 58 Ranchero. You just never know how many people that you're affecting when you have a car that's this iconic. And you know, Gene may not have even realized that during that time that this car was a fan favorite or that it was putting a smile on a lot of people's faces. But now he knows. Hearing all these stories and hearing all these real life experiences of people who remembered the car, people who, you know, dreamed about that car, and now he's getting to see that, he's getting to hear those stories, getting to see those people that he affected long ago. I mean, Quain Stott is a good example of that. He saw this car when he was just a kid, and it made him want to build a drag car. And it's just cool that he ended up being a part of this car's rebuild. Now, Gene hasn't raced it quite as much as he was there back in 2014 through about 2017. But the car is still out there. It's still running. It's, you know, it's something that he's still holding on to. And you can bet that the Cromer family is just in love with this car even more now than ever, because you know, it's continuing Gene's legacy, it's continuing the Moonlighters' legacy. It's really, you know, it's just a piece of history and it's a piece of their family. So, you know, it's not going anywhere anytime soon, and it's continuing to hold a special place in a lot of people's hearts. And that's what's cool about it to me, is that this car is more than just metal and fiberglass and more than just that Ford motor, and it's more than those magnesium wheels. It's more than that. It's a very meaningful car. You know, it's just irreplaceable. I hope you enjoyed following along with the history of the Moonlighters Willys. I plan on featuring many more historic drag cars in the future, so stay tuned. Thank you for watching.